few weeks ago, I realised a bit of a teenage dream and got my hands on and built a Warhammer Citadel fortress. I had loads of fun doing this and can't wait to play some siege games, and I started to think about the homebrew lore that I was going to build for my Bretonnian army and started to look at what the old world development diaries were saying. There was a lot of focus on the border princes, and I thought it would be a really cool idea to set my Bretonnians there and leave them pretty flexible to my own lore. So I picked a point on the map and started to think a little bit about what I wanted their background to be, and I've got loads and loads of scribbled notes and things for that, and I won't deliver that in this video. But what it did get me doing was delving closer and deeper into the Border Prince's history, looking back at old Warhammer Fantasy roleplay supplements, and it got me thinking about another game. Now, I missed Mordheim the first time around. I was off at university pretending not to be a nerd, but it's been on my to-do list for years, and I've decided recently to give it a go. And I thought, well, why not make Mordheim set in the Principality of my Bretonnian Lord and link it to my ongoing lore for the old world and link it to my games from the old world as well. Welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart, and this is my first video on Mordheim set in the timeline for Warhammer the Old World, and in this first video I build my town. I started off by laying out my castle and playing around with it in a 4x4 setup, trying to figure out how I could set it out on the table. The idea is to imagine that the castle fortified town goes off backwards off the boards. You've got to imagine some of it, and you'd be looking at the main gates and the initial buildings and things, and I used my iPad to sort of scribble some basic outline of where I wanted things to be. I often dive into these things headlong and don't plan too much, and while I do that to a certain extent here, I wanted to have at least something down on paper, on screen as it really was, and just to give me a bit of an idea of what to purchase. First off, I definitely needed some buildings, and I could go down the 3D printed route, but I don't have an FDM printer as yet. And I like the idea of being able to take this table's worth of terrain and pack it up and take it to Warhammer World for some games with some of my friends who play there. And if I get loads and loads of third-party stuff, I'm never going to be able to do that. So how to do it and stick to GW? So I decided to stick to the Middle-earth range and these fantastic Lake Town houses. Now, I believe it's Ray Dramfield who designed these, along with the Rohan houses and along with a lot of the modern terrain, and they are absolutely fantastic. I've built lots of the Rohan houses before. They're very, very modular and loads of cool little extras. I was a little bit worried about the potential of scale being a little bit off. Middle-earth Tragedy Battle game is a 28mm true scale game, or at least it used to be. There's a little bit of scale creep, as there is in all games these days, not just GW. But anyone that knows medieval houses are pretty small and rickety anyway, and these are absolutely fine. And what they did give me was this perfect kind of wooden timber frame style look, which would just look so good in a rickety street that you imagine with Mordheim and that kind of game setting. So I set about building the initial 3 buildings that I had, knowing that I've got all the little extra wooden planking and bases that come with these Lake Town houses, because Lake Town is obviously set on a lake. I knew that I could use them for walkways, and I had a few other little ideas in mind. These buildings really are fantastic. You've got loads of choice when building. The walls are reversible, so you can have different window designs. You've got outhousing you can stick on the side, little apex roofs and things. Loads of things to make them different and unique, while also tying them together with one single theme. With the first buildings built, I started to look at all the little extra bits. There's boats, there's walkways, there's the platforms for the buildings, and I started to formulate some ideas. I also had a big bag of bits left over from Rohan houses that I'd built a long time ago, enough with some spare walls that I hope to make an extra shack or something like that. There's loads of fishing stuff, and I thought, well, as it's a coastal castle, I can maybe make it a little minor fishing port or something for the people that are living there. So I set about building my first little extra, using supports there just from bits of sprue and spare bits from the Rohan house. I built a little fishing shack. I thought it'd be really fun to, on the corner of the board, to have a small jetty with a couple of boats and a small fishing shack outside of the castle walls, but also to give extra flavour. And these are things that I intend to use in games of Warhammer as well. They don't always have to be set up in this way. I want to keep this build pretty modular, so that all the terrain can come off and be used in different gaming situations. So cracking on with the kit bashing, I glued together a couple of the bases for those lake town houses, turning it into a bit of a raised platform for the town square, somewhere you can go and buy your fish and watch a hanging at the same time. Found an MDF base and started to work on that little jetty idea I had to go in the corner of the table. Built this strange contraption here from some leftover Rohan buildings. The idea was it being a little bit of a guardsman's shelter for those wet, windy, rainy days you have by the coast. For when they're on lookout duty, they've got somewhere that they can still see, but being a bit sheltered. Just adds a little bit of variety to the castle walls. I saved these bits as an idea to go as a raised platform around the centre tower in the castle, which is now going to become a keep, and then build a little sort of flag shelter and a bell for warning as well. Not long after that, my next purchase arrived. Now, I really wanted a full fortified manor, but they're going for £400 on eBay, but I did manage to find a chapel for a reasonable price. I also dug out some more of an old Lord of the Rings toy. Now, this will be the only non-GW thing. I'm hoping that I'll conceal it enough, and it being a toy rather than a model kit, I might be able to sneak it onto a table in Warhammer World. The parts weren't complete, so I needed to use some blue foam to sort of finish them off a little bit, build an extra couple of steps here and there. But in the end, the result was pretty pleasing, especially with some paint on it. Then I went crazy with some super glue and activator and used it to glue the two halves together and fill all the gaps in. I thought this would be a really cool raised platform, maybe something that would be nice to put the chapel on. So at this stage, the layout was growing nicely. I had an extra piece of wall arrived as well. You can see it black there in the center, and you can see the little platform up around the center tower now, which is the small keep. So the next stage was to work on the mat, and I turned to Woodland Scenics. Now this stuff has a plastic backing on it, which means you can paint on top of it and it doesn't warp too much. Why not build a board, you would ask? Well, I want this to be easily carried around. I wanted to be able to roll it up just gently, just slightly. So I cut out a 4x4 strip. In fact, I already had a 4x4 strip cut out. And you can see that there's already marks on it where I've done some light airbrushing before just to give it a bit more texture. There's going to be lots more of that to come. So I set it out on the table, and then I started relaying all my stuff down on it again to try and work out what the final layout would be. I did toy with the idea of picking up more castle walls, so the table was pretty much all castle wall and everything was in the centre. But I really wanted the idea of that feeling that this is a small fortified town rather than the edge of a sprawling castle. Now you are supposed to imagine that where I'm standing there off to the far side, that the walls do extend and there are lots more houses and things, but not to the point where it's a metropolis. So all in all, I was pretty happy with the initial layout, but I did want more buildings. Not only did it not feel town enough, and I do want it to feel town enough for a game of Mordheim, it also just felt a little bit sort of sparse on the inside. And again, for a skirmish game on a 4x4 like this, I wanted to concentrate the action inside the town. So I wanted more buildings to have cover and more ways to climb up on the walls. So I needed some extra ladders and things like that. So with that in mind, I picked up a couple more of the Lake Town houses and then one more of these Rohan kits, which I've built lots of in the past. With one of the Lake Town houses and the Rohan kit, I built this. My mate Dan kindly pointed out that it needed an inn, and he was totally right. Now, I did look online for some other ways of doing an inn, something quite striking as a centerpiece. The old Warhammer Forge Inn is very, very rare and goes for about £500 on eBay, so that was out of the question, but I was pretty happy with the way this came out. And then I also built the two remaining kits up as buildings. So with those added, I felt like we were nearly there, and I haven't talked about it much in the background, but we got a few old Warhammer trees and some raised areas using blue foam. There's also some walls and fencing that came from the new Warcry small starter set, which I'm using as a way to border those small areas of trees at the back. The idea is that as the edge of a cemetery or something like that, the inn's in pride of place. You've got the hanging area stroke fish market in the centre as well. And then you've got your Warhammer chapel all up on its little mount. Now it was time to really crack on and start getting bits finished, so I turned to my blue foam hills that I had carved and grabbed out my heat gun just to smooth off the edges. Then I covered them quite heavily in some Vallejo basing texture. This is dark earth. Once the basing texture was dry, I whacked on loads and loads of white glue, a really thick layer, and started whacking on some flock. And once it was dry, I did seal it off camera with a mix of white PVA, water and some ISO to help it flow through a squirty bottle. And it's pretty rock hard now. While those were all drying, I went to the painting side of things. Now, this isn't a full tutorial, so to speak, so if you want to hear me talk a little bit more in detail about how I'm using the colours I showed on the screen there, go and watch the castle tutorial if you haven't already. For these first things I'm painting, I'm using exactly the same method and the same greys that I did for that part. I had a lot to work through, including on these little bits of terrain I mentioned from the new Warcry starter set, which were really nice and spooky additions to the table and make fantastic walls to the cemetery at the back. I also used the same grey mix for the lower areas of the Warhammer chapel. Now, technically, the Bretonnians wouldn't have a chapel to Sigmar. That would be a little bit strange, but the lore for my Bretonnians is that they've moved in on a bit of an abandoned town. Things happen fast in the Border Princes. Land changes hands often, and the idea is this was once an Empire outpost that's now been taken over by them. So you can see me here building up the layers of grey, just like I did with the castle wall. I'm trying to leave the previous grey in place each time, so you're just highlighting and slowly building it up. The final layers can look really quite light when you first put them down, but once you weather afterwards, the extra contrast that you've added there, as in contrast in colour rather than contrast in the type of paint itself, which I use a lot of, not to be confused, but the extra contrast you build in there really comes back and helps you out when you weather later on. For the roof, I decided to add a thin layer of Incubi Darkness to go for that kind of blued tiled effect, which looks so cool on fantasy buildings. So then I cracked out the pure white to really focus on areas of skulls. There's some candles on those walls and things. Again, if you're careful enough with the airbrush, you can save yourself lots of time by using the airbrush to do such things. And I also painted in some white on the walls of the chapel as well, so away from the grey area. Now, you've got to be careful here, you don't want to go over your darker grey parts, but again, you're just highlighting before you weather here and really taking some of the time out of the process. With all that airbrushing done, it was time for lots of dry brushing. Now I'm using a mixture of makeup brushes and some of the Artist Opus style dry brushes that I bought on Amazon, and these are pretty good. I do have some Artist Opus ones as well, but after 18 months of use, they finally succumbed to age. After that, it was time to crack out the contrast paint, and I'm using some Garagax Sewer and some Rattling Grime here. I'm very carefully, I thin this slightly with water, but I'm very carefully adding in some shadows here, going around the edges of pillars, going in between the lines where the brickwork breaks up from the normal sort of plaster and things. And once you've used the airbrush a little bit, you'll find that you can do stuff like this, and it just saves so much time, and you can see the immediate effect you get from adding those shadows in, and all those highlights suddenly start tying in together. I've also added some rain streaks and weathering and things to the roof with it as well. Then I use the same mix to go and shade in and add some other texture to all of the rock areas and things, just again like I did on the castle tutorial. Once all the airbrushing was done, it was time to grab out the hairy brush to do some detailing, and again I started with things like contrast paint on the doors. You've got that lovely bright white door there, it's perfect for something like Garagax Sewer to go on and create that nice wood grain effect for you. Using some Skeleton Horde and some Militarum green here, I started to add in some tonal changes and things to the walls, again just like I did with the castle, so little patches of green, little patches of brown, and it really just adds to the realism and the weathered look of the overall building, and it's just so quick and easy to do it this way if you can do. You can see the effect that it has when you add it to the walls on the chapel and onto the roof for extra streaking and grime. I won't list all the other colours I use, but there was obviously lots of other little bits of detailing to do on the buildings. I added in the flame using some contrast paints, and then cracked out the metallics to add in the details to the railings on the fences and the few areas of metallics that are on the chapel. There's lots of dry brushing involved on the bones around the cemetery area itself. I added some dry pigment and then finished off with some European mud effect around the bottom of the building, and this will hopefully help them tie into the mat itself, which I'm going to heavily texture later. Now onto the trees that I'm using. These are all the old Citadel wood trees, and I'm using this range of brown paints here. Pause the screen if you want to see what they are, but the idea is to do a bit of a zenithal effect. So start with the lightest brown, mostly top down, leaving some of the black showing through, and then slowly building up through the spectrum of colours, and then with the top colour, the brightest colour, dry brushing it. Once all those airbrush layers were applied and the dry brushing was done afterwards, I went back with the same rattling grime and Garagax sewer and green contrast paints thin through the airbrush, and just added patches just like I did on the walls to tie it all in, glaze it back a little bit and give them some extra spooky depth. And these were some of the first things that were completed. So there's the chapel, which who knows what the Bretonnian lords will be worshipping there, but probably not Sigmar. And then you can see with the hills that are actually finished at this stage, they weren't by the time I was recording them, but you can see the way the trees, the hills and those little walls look for the borders of the cemetery, and those little kits that come in that Warcry starter set are absolutely fantastic for it. So you can see the way the board is looking, you see the direction it's going in. So the next challenge is to get my mat looking something like the same level of detail of those hills and the terrain I've already painted, rather than looking like this plain or almost plain mat you can see there. And what I'm playing around with there is some wallpaper, which is in the texture of something that could be used as sort of cobblestones. And I decided that I was going to tear sections of this up and stick it down on the board. Now, as I said before, I really wanted a look of a real terrain board, but be also to keep it fairly portable. I just don't have space to store big 4x4 boards. Got loads of space for terrain and things, and I've got a loft above my office, but the hatch size won't fit boards through, so I need stuff that rolls up. So you see there all of the walkways and things all laid out after I've torn them, and then it is just a matter of sticking them down with lots and lots and lots of white glue. Then after they're stuck down, putting more and more white glue back over the top of them. After the first layer, I started adding black paint to the mix, and this is just kids' cheap acrylic paint, not good for painting miniatures, but great for terrain, and it saves the more expensive stuff. It also helps show me where I've covered it in PVA glue, because I really want to kind of seal it in. Now all that is going to take a long time to dry, so I head back to some terrain. Now this is some old terrain I have back from when I played 8th edition. It's not painted anywhere near as well as I'd like, so rather than strip it and go again, I decided to try and rescue it. So I started by dry brushing over the wooden areas and seeing if I can pick out that detail back again. And the idea then is to just glaze back over it with some contrast paints and just give it a little bit more depth than I painted back in my younger modelling days, not that much younger. I did the same for the walls as well, just picked out the detail a little bit, and the idea was to glaze back and then re-weather. Once all that was dry, I went back and gave it a slight dry brush again to remove some of the gloss and do pick out some of the detail, but make it a little bit more refined than my dry brushing back was in 2011, 2012, or whenever it was I painted these. The old flock from back in the day was still on the base as well, and it looks pretty bland and poorly applied. So I sprayed it all over with rattling grime rather than trying to remove it. Tried to sort of dull it down and cover it over. And then the idea was to add some weathering pigments, as I would often do to my bases, rub it into the bottoms of the walls and things as well, creating that extra texture. And then afterwards, apply some PVA and add in the same flock that I'm using on my hills. At this point, things are slowly drying on the mat, so the next stage is coming up, and I started to draw around everything in position on the mat as it was, because I want to take everything off and start detailing the mat, and that's going to involve lots of texture paint, lots of effects and things, and it's going to get stuff everywhere. But I really want to also use the airbrush to build in some shadow where the pieces of terrain are going to be, so they look like they're in situ rather than just sitting flush on the top. I want things to look like they belong there. And the best way to do that is to kind of build the terrain in on the table to match that. So you can see here the terrain has been removed. I start to work with my airbrush, mapping out where the buildings were going to be, making those areas darker, but making the footprints larger than the buildings, so they already sit on a darker area. And it's one of those trust the process thing, because it looks pretty awful for quite a while. So at the same time, using the same paints, I just airbrushed the edges of my hills to make them tie into the mat and add some sort of shadow at the bottom. And I really think, again, that helps them look like it's part of an overall terrain piece rather than stuff sitting flat and flush on a mat. Now on to trusty Vallejo diorama FX, and these are mud effects. So we have a European mud and industrial mud. Those are the ones I'll be using most, but I'm also using some of the dark earth texture as well. So the dark earth texture goes down first. I'm stippling it on everywhere, mostly over the edges of where these sort of wallpaper cobblestone tracks and things I've made. I like the idea that there was lots more cobblestone at one point and it's all become overgrown. What I don't want it to do is look like a kid's school project as it does at the moment. So I really wanted to blend in the edges of where the cobblestone was with the mat. So that means some texture paint to hide those joints to start with, and I'll slowly spread it out into the mat, getting lesser and lesser, and then using more spraying with the airbrush afterwards, and lots of the mud effect will hopefully have one big piece that actually looks like it should all be there. So here's me starting to dull down some of the edges again using the airbrush, and this is lots of thinned contrast paint, mostly turned into washes and like inks effectively. At this stage you can see that it's starting to work, that it's blending into the map nicely, and it just needs lots and lots of mud effect to slowly make sure that it looks like one piece of land rather than something that's been stuck on top of the mat. And of course with the terrain on there, that will tie it all more in anyway. So that was all going to take an awful long time to dry, and that's why I did it at that stage. And now it was time to really focus on getting the bulk of the stuff painted. So we had all of the buildings to do, all of the wooden stuff I built, but essentially everything from these Rohan kits and the Lake Town kits. I'm using a mix of Garrigax Suicidal Brown and Creed Camo here. Now these are all thinned 50-50 with water, so almost like a watercolor. The idea is I just paint them on in alternate colors and let them blend together, and you end up with this really nice effect where the wood looks not quite silvered, I suppose, but very well weathered and almost like it's wet quite a lot, and that suits really well for the fishing jetty, of course, and the boats, but I think also works quite well for the well-used wood in the center of the fortified town itself. There's fish barrels and things everywhere. I like the idea that fish are brought in quite a lot, so these areas are never really fully dry. There's always weather and things coming off the coast, and while it's not always cold, wet and windy, I think that wood takes a real battering. I'm later to add some clear resin to the top of the water, but I needed to give it some blue underneath as well, so I built that up first, again with contrast colours. I don't think it matters too much what colours you do, but I wanted to add a couple of blues, so something slightly turquoise and something quite blue as well. Blend them a bit together, knowing that the real effect will be when I add the resin afterwards. For the buildings, I wanted to go down a different route rather than the normal contrast route to start with, so I decided to go down the dry brush route. I wanted the buildings to look sort of that almost blacked wooden beams, and that was going to be a nightmare to paint them all back in afterwards if I primed with white zenithal. So I gave all of the buildings a nice dry brush of grey in two levels, and then afterwards the plan would be to paint the individual panels in. I figured that would be easier than going the opposite way around. I did something similar on the roofs as well, but took that much lighter. I also used the same colour, which is deck tan, incidentally, to go back over all of those nice wood areas I've just done. Now there's very little paint on this big dry brush, very little at all. I'm just gently stroking it over and just picking out the edges again, and I think it just adds to that weathered wood look effect. So the next stage was to add a lighter colour back in so I could do all of those panels. So I did a bit of a mixture of dry brushing and over brushing here, trying to keep away from the black or greyed planking, but also leaving enough that I could add a contrast colour in the middle and pick it out and make it sort of stand out. And as you can see, when you add a contrast style paint afterwards and let it flow into all of that detail where you've just dry brushed, it covers the bits you can't see, so it tidies it all up and blends it all back in, but gives a really nice effect. I'm not going to list all of the different colours I used on each of the buildings because it would take me ages, and again this video would just be too long, but go with the colours you like if you're following along any of these ideas at home. For the end, I took a little bit more time with the dry brushing rather than doing any over brushing. Just took a little bit of time building it up slowly, and it gave a slightly duller but more refined look. I quite like the idea that it's a well used tavern. There's lots of travellers passing through it, and it's very dirty and grimy. With the roofs pre-highlighted with the dry brushing effect, they take colour fantastically, and I think that this was a sort of Leviathan blue or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but applying that straight to the top of the building and gives a really, really nice effect. Very, very similar to the sort of colouring style that you get with the Incubi Darkness painted directly onto the chapel roof. I didn't want every roof to look the same, so I also used some Black Legion, which is a kind of a brownish tone to it again, but it provided another nice alternative colouring for one of the roofs of the buildings. Now once all of those base layers were fully dry, again I gave pretty much the whole building a really, really light dry brush with deck tan. It just helped tidy it all a little bit in, gave it a little bit more weathered look. I could catch some of the detailing, which I haven't recorded all of it in this video again to keep the length of the video down, but you're obviously picking out things like the nets and the baskets and the chains and things on the side. You can see that the overall effect of adding this later dry brushing stage afterwards just ties it all in, and I think it just looks fantastic on this in here. I actually used some thin colour shift paint here to paint over the tops of the fish. It does give you this nice sort of bluish tinted glow, and over the blue fish that I've already painted on there, you get that kind of silvery effect. We're getting quite close to the end now and turning to my favourite trio of metallic colours. I went around picking out all of the little extra details that should be metallics. You've got rims on barrels, you've got hooks, you've got chains, you've got little bolts and things here and there. Not to mention the door handles and the edges of the little lamps and things as well. And then I wanted to make sure that these buildings sat into their environment as well. So that bottom sort of ½ an inch of the building, I brushed in some dry pigment, really rubbed it in, feathering out as you go up to look like ingrained dirt and things like that. And then just like I did with some of the other buildings, I added some mud effect to the bottom as well, and it just gives this really, really nice grimy pleasing effect, which should mean they look at home on the mat. And here we have some more finished parts. So we see the little fishing shack there, and the little jetty with the boats and the little fence, and that'll go in the corner of the table. And again, I can use that in another Warhammer games. I can use it in Lord of the Rings games if I wanted to. So a very versatile piece of terrain, but it should fit nicely on the board. And I'm really happy with the way these Lake Town buildings can quite easily be turned into something very reminiscent of a Warhammer town, especially the older style Warhammer you remember maybe from some 3rd edition, that kind of feel. But I think that the colours just look striking when you dry brush back over afterwards, and I really like the way these buildings have come out. Really, really happy with them, and I may well buy more and add more in the future. The inn came out really, really well. I'm very happy with it, and you'll notice that the signs are currently blank, so I'd love for someone to name the inn for me. So I'll do a little bit of a competition. So if you pop a name of the inn that you think in the comments below, if there's enough good ones, I will do a poll, but whoever ends up being the winner, I will send something to. Nothing too exciting, maybe just some miniature arms dice or something like that, but get naming it. Let's see what you can come up with. So with all the texturing on the mat now fully dry, it was time to put everything back on. And as you can see, as we fly over the town here, everything I think looks pretty cool. And I've got the effect of a terrain board, which is what I really, really wanted, on a more movable mat. And all of this, as I said, is modular and can be moved and can be used in different settings. But I'm really happy with the way it came out. This was my vision. This is what I had in my head when I decided to do it. And there were a couple of stages where I was worried it wouldn't end up looking like it does, but I'm pretty happy with the way it came out. And I think it looks pretty grim and grimy down there. You can see with all that mud effect and stuff when it dries, that it looks like it should be there, that those cobblestone areas that I've put in just look like part of the map now. They don't look like anything's just stuck down. It's all blended and smoothed in, and yeah, this looks pretty cool. You just got to imagine the town being probably 3 times the size of it, more town, and you know, these cemeteries at the back there with some gravestones in. I probably should have a couple of gravestones at some point. And this little separate tower that became my Lord's Keep with his little flag there. Notice a slight change to the emblem on the flag. I'll talk about that in a future Bretonnian video. And there's some little ladders and things which I didn't put in the video that I've added, so that you can climb up and down during the game of Mordheim. And little climbing bits there to get up onto the raised areas, and again, I'm just really happy with the way this came out. Really can't wait to play some games on it. I'm working on some warbands right now. There's going to be a Tomb King warband, there's going to be a Witch Hunters warband, there's going to be an Undead warband, and there's also going to be a Bretonnian warband, of course, as well. So I'm going to work on 4 warbands for future videos, so do look out for those in the near future. And let me know what you think of this. I've had lots of fun doing it. Anything you think I should add to it, I do have room to add stuff. Anything you think doesn't work, I'm a big boy, I can take it. But hopefully it's something that's pretty cool, and you realise that you don't have to always have a massive board to have a really nice immersive set of terrain. Sometimes these lovely printed maps these days are fantastic, but they just don't give you quite the right feel, and you can do a bit of a halfway house with these. I've had so much fun doing this, and hope you've enjoyed watching the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed the video, please do consider giving it a like. It really helps the video get seen by other people, helps the algorithm and all of those things. It's all a bit cheesy, but it really does do a good job in helping me out. And if you haven't already and you like this kind of video, please consider subscribing to the channel. There's going to be lots of this kind of content on the channel moving forward, along with all the other stuff that's already on there. So many different game systems to suit many different flavors of gaming, be that historical, science fiction, or fantasy. What you think of the game of Mordheim? I'm yet to play it. I'm really excited about working on my warbands while I'm waiting for the release of the Old World as well. And what do you think of my idea of setting it during the Old World timeline and setting it down in the Border Princes? For me, it's a kind of a perfect meld of my bigger battles with Warhammer, the Old World, and making it more of an engaging sort of lore for my games of Mordheim. But all in all, this has been a long video compared to some, so thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I will catch you soon.